Tonight, a single poppy seed drifts on the evening wind, crossing mountains and oceans, carrying with it a quiet promise and an unspoken doom. In this story, we will follow how something soft, fragrant, and soothing crept into palaces and ports, until it weakened the pillars of one of the world's greatest empires. Before we begin, take a moment to gently support the channel by liking this video, subscribing if you enjoy calm, immersive history stories, and leaving a comment to let me know where you're watching from. Are you listening late at night in the United States, as the house finally grows quiet? Is it early morning in Europe, the sky just beginning to pale? Or perhaps you're in Canada or somewhere else in the world, wrapped in a blanket at an unusual hour. Tell us what time it is for you. Now, settle back, loosen your shoulders, slow your breathing, and let the outside world fade. When you're ready, we'll return to the story, step by gentle step. Long before smoke curled through darkened rooms, before silver flowed outward instead of in, China rested in the deep confidence of its own greatness. The Qing Empire stretched vast and wide, from frozen northern plains to lush southern rivers, from deserts where wind sang through sand to crowded cities humming with life. At night, lantern light shimmered along canals, reflecting red and gold ripples on the water, while the steady creak of wooden boats lulled travelers toward sleep. The empire believed itself complete. It had ancient laws, refined arts, and a bureaucracy polished by centuries of ritual and examination. Silk rustled softly in palace corridors. Ink brushed across paper in scholars' studies, the scent of pine-soot ink mingling with warm tea. Farmers, far from the capital, lay down on straw mats after long days in the fields, trusting the emperor far away yet ever present to keep the heavens in balance. Foreign traders arrived at China's edges like distant whispers. They were permitted to dock, to trade under strict rules, and then to leave again. China needed little from the outside world. Porcelain, tea, and silk flowed outward like a calm, controlled tide, while silver flowed inward, reinforcing the sense that the Middle Kingdom sat at the center of everything that mattered. In this moment, the empire felt eternal. There was no urgency, no fear, just the slow turning of seasons, the reassuring repetition of ceremony, and the belief that harmony, once achieved, could last forever. Yet even in these peaceful nights, something subtle was changing, quiet as breath, patient as time, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. At first, opium did not arrive as a villain. It came softly, wrapped in the language of healing. In small apothecary shops tucked along narrow streets, dried poppy resin rested in ceramic jars, labeled with careful brushstrokes. Physicians spoke of balance, of easing pain, calming coughs, quieting restless bodies so that sleep could come. Measured doses were prescribed, mixed with herbs, dissolved into dark, bitter teas. In the evenings, as lamps were lit and shadows deepened, some found relief in its warmth. A tired merchant soothed aching joints after weeks on the road. An elderly scholar eased the tightness in his chest, breathing more freely as he drifted into gentle dreams. Opium, in these early days, felt like a small kindness, another tool within a vast and ancient medical tradition. The empire saw no threat in this. Why would it? The substance was controlled, its use limited, its purpose clear. Officials trusted that tradition and restraint would hold firm. Life continued at its unhurried pace. Crickets sang beyond courtyard walls. Incense burned low and steady, its smoke curling upward like a silent prayer. But comfort has a way of inviting repetition. What soothed pain once could soothe it again. What quieted the body could also quiet the mind, smoothing sharp edges of worry and fatigue. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, The boundary between medicine and indulgence began to blur. No alarms sounded. No proclamations were issued. The empire slept on, unaware that a door had opened, not wide, not suddenly, but just enough for something far more powerful to slip inside and make itself at home. Far from the quiet courtyards and orderly streets of the interior, the southern ports breathed a different air. Here, the sea never slept. Waves brushed against wooden hulls with a steady, rhythmic sigh, and foreign ships lingered just beyond the horizon, their masts rising like thin lines against the pale sky. The scent of salt mixed with tar, tea leaves, and unfamiliar spices, creating an atmosphere both lively and unsettled. It was in these harbors that opium began to change its shape. No longer only a medicine measured by physicians, it arrived packed tightly in chests, stacked deep within ships' holds. Traders spoke in low voices, hands gesturing softly, deals sealed not with ceremony but with quiet understanding. Silver passed from palm to palm, cool and heavy, reflecting lantern light in brief flashes. Along the docks, curiosity stirred. Sailors and laborers watched as small parcels disappeared into warehouses, then into the city beyond. In dim back rooms near the water, pipes were lit, and the air grew thick with sweet, heavy smoke. The sound of the port creaking ropes, distant calls, the slap of waves seemed to soften, as if wrapped in cotton. For some, this new ritual felt like a brief escape from hardship. Muscles loosened after long hours of carrying cargo. Thoughts slowed, drifting like boats untethered from shore. Night stretched longer, warmer, quieter. The harbor lights shimmered and blurred, reflections trembling gently on the dark water. Still, the empire's heart remained calm. Officials believed the sea was far away, its troubles unable to reach the capital's steady pulse. What began at the edges, they assumed, would stay at the edges, and so the smoke continued to rise, thin and pale, carried inland by trade winds that no one thought to fear. For generations, silver had streamed into China like a dependable river. Foreign merchants brought it willingly, exchanging heavy coins for tea, silk, and porcelain treasures. The world seemed unable to resist. The empire grew accustomed to this rhythm, confident in its strength, certain that balance favored its side. But quietly, the current began to turn. At first, it was barely noticeable. A few more coins left the country than arrived, a minor discrepancy, icily dismissed. Yet in coastal cities, accountants started to frown over their ledgers. Lines of ink no longer matched as neatly as before. Chests that once felt satisfyingly full now rang hollow when opened. Opium was the reason, though few spoke its name aloud. Foreign traders had found something China would buy endlessly, something that did not satisfy like tea or cloth, but instead asked for more each time. Silver slipped outward in steady trickles, then in streams, then in flows that could no longer be ignored. In markets far from the sea, the effects were felt in subtle ways. Prices crept upward. Farmers needed more coins to pay their taxes. Shopkeepers weighed silver carefully, their expressions tightening as they did the math in their heads. The empire's great machine still functioned, but its gears no longer turned as smoothly. At night, under the same moon that had watched over centuries of prosperity, officials lay awake longer than before. The air felt heavier. Something was off balance, though its shape remained unclear. Outside, wind rustled bamboo leaves, whispering of change, while the slow outward drift of silver continued, unseen but relentless. What began along the coast did not remain there. Trade routes stretched like veins across the empire, carrying silk, grain, letters and habits. Caravans moved slowly along dusty roads. Riverboats glided inland on broad, patient waters. With them traveled small packets wrapped in cloth, passed hand to hand without ceremony. In towns far from the sea, opium appeared in subtle ways. A traveler shared a pipe one evening, speaking casually of how it eased the body after a hard journey. A shopkeeper tried it once, then again, enjoying the way the world seemed to soften at the edges. No fanfare followed, no sudden collapse, just a gradual rearranging of evenings and priorities. Rooms grew quieter, laughter faded sooner, lamps burned later as figures reclined against cushions, eyes half-lidded, listening to their own slow breathing. Outside, night insects sang as they always had, unaware that something inside these walls was changing. The empire did not feel under attack. It felt calm to calm. Local officials heard rumors but hesitated. The substance was legal in small amounts, familiar and difficult to condemn without causing unrest. To interfere felt unnecessary, even unkind. Better to trust tradition, to believe moderation would prevail. And so the habit deepened, like roots sinking into soft soil. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that the quiet spread inland continued, unchallenged, while the great empire breathed steadily, unaware of how much of its strength was slowly being lulled to sleep. There were voices that spoke against the haze, though they were calm, measured, and easy to overlook. A few scholars wrote careful essays, their brushstrokes precise, their language respectful. They warned of imbalance not only in silver and trade, but in spirit and discipline. An empire, they suggested, could not remain strong if too many of its people drifted through their days half awake. In quiet meetings, some officials nodded in agreement. They had seen clerks arrive late, eyes dull, fingers trembling slightly as they dipped brushes into ink. They noticed soldiers lingering longer in rest, drills growing less sharp. These were not catastrophes, merely small frays at the edge of order. But China was vast, and its systems slow to change. Each concern passed through layers of review, ceremony, and debate. By the time a warning reached higher offices, it often sounded softened, distant, less urgent than when it was first spoken. Besides, the empire had survived countless challenges before. Why should this be different? Outside, life appeared unchanged. Markets still bustled at dawn. Bells rang at temple gates. Farmers bent their backs to the fields, planting and harvesting as their ancestors had done. The rhythm of daily life lulled decision-makers into patience, so the warnings remained words on paper, folded neatly and filed away. The smoke continued to rise in back rooms and private quarters, thin and fragrant, drifting upward as if carrying those unheeded cautions into the night air, where they dissolved and were forgotten. Within the forbidden city, behind walls painted deep red and gold, unease began to stir. The emperor, seated beneath carved beams and watching silk banners stir in the faint indoor breeze, listened as reports were read aloud in steady, formal tones. Numbers were mentioned: silver, trade, discipline. Each sounded manageable on its own, yet together they formed a pattern that refused to settle. The emperor was not a distant dreamer. He had inherited the weight of centuries, the responsibility to keep heaven and earth aligned. At night, when court noises faded and only the soft padding of guards' steps echoed through corridors, he felt the imbalance more keenly. The empire's pulse seemed slower, its breath uneven. From palace windows, he looked out over rooftops and gardens, moonlight pooling on stone paths. Somewhere beyond those walls, people slept or failed to. The idea unsettled him. Strength was not only measured in armies or treasury chests, but in clarity of mind, in readiness of spirit. Edicts were discussed, then softened. Advisors urged caution. To act too harshly might disrupt trade. provoke foreign powers, or anger local elites. To act too slowly might invite decay. The emperor stood at the center of these tensions, weighing each choice carefully, feeling time slip quietly past. Incense burned low beside him, its smoke curling upward, mirroring the very substance he now feared. He closed his eyes briefly, listening to his own breath, wondering how something that arrived so gently could carry such heavy consequences, and whether it was already too late to stop it. When action finally came, it arrived quietly, dressed in formal language and stamped with official seals. New regulations were announced in measured tones, read aloud in courtyards where officials stood straight-backed and attentive. Opium, the proclamation said, was to be restricted, its trade limited, its misuse discouraged for the good of the people and the harmony of the realm. On paper, the rules were clear. In practice, they drifted like mist. Along the coast, traders adapted with practiced ease. Chests were relabeled, routes shifted slightly, favoring smaller ports and hidden coves where lanterns burned low and questions were few. Inland, local authorities enforced the bans unevenly. Some took the emperor's concern to heart, closing dens and confiscating pipes. Others looked away, weary of conflict or quietly benefiting from the trade themselves. For ordinary people, the changes felt confusing rather than decisive. A substance once tolerated was now frowned upon, yet still available if one knew where to look. The habit did not vanish, it simply slipped further into shadow. Rooms grew darker, conversations grew more hushed, smoke curled closer to the floor, as if trying not to be seen. The empire had taken its first step, but it was a hesitant one. Like a sleeper stirring without waking, China shifted slightly, sensing discomfort but not yet ready to rise. Beyond the walls and rivers, forces already in motion adjusted their course, patient and determined, waiting to see what the next breath would bring. Section 9. Foreign interests awaken across the sea, far from lantern-lit courtyards and river towns. Decisions were being made in rooms filled with maps and ledgers. There, opium was not a moral question but a calculation. It balanced books, reversed silver flows, and promised profit on a scale few commodities could match. The bans issued by the Qing court were noted, discussed, and quietly challenged. Merchants spoke of free trade and fair exchange, their words smooth and confident. Ships continued to sail, their holds heavy, their captains experienced in navigating not just currents and storms, but laws and loopholes. When ports tightened restrictions, pressure followed letters, demands, and carefully worded protests, delivered with polite firmness. Back in China's harbors, tension thickened the air. Officials stood watchful at docks, aware that each incoming vessel carried more than goods, it carried intent. Conversations grew sharper, misunderstandings multiplied. What one side called regulation, the other called obstruction. At night, the sea reflected moonlight in broken paths that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Ships rocked gently, patient, as if they could wait forever. The Empire's attempt to regain balance had stirred something larger than itself, awakening forces that moved to different rhythms, faster, louder, less willing to slow. The quiet struggle was no longer contained within China's borders. It had spread outward, joining the vast, restless world beyond, where power was measured not in harmony, but in leverage. Far from the grand halls of the emperor and the bustling harbor ports, the common people discovered opium in their own private worlds. In dimly lit rooms, behind paper screens, villagers, merchants, and laborers sought a small relief from exhaustion, from worry, from the relentless demands of life. A bowl of hot water, a carefully prepared mixture, a slender pipe. These became tiny sanctuaries of calm. The smell was sweet, almost floral, drifting lazily through rooms as smoke curled in slow, deliberate patterns. Eyes half closed, bodies relaxed into cushions and mats. Hearts slowed, thoughts softened. Outside, wind whispered through trees and along riverbanks, carrying the faint sense of rice fields and soil into night air. Some found comfort in routine, a quiet evening after the day's labor, a shared moment among friends or family. Others were drawn in subtly, taking more than intended, lingering longer in the hazy warmth. It was neither violent nor loud. It was a slow surrender, unnoticed by neighbors, unrecorded in official reports. In the countryside, the nights grew stiller. Crickets hummed their eternal song, and the moon traced silver patterns across the landscape. The empire appeared unchanged, yet beneath that calm surface, habits were shifting, roots slowly entwining with daily life. Small indulgences grew into steady rhythms, and the people, gently lulled, unknowingly participated in a transformation that would ripple outward, touching cities, ports, and the highest corridors of power alike. In the quiet chambers of China's academies, scholars bent over scrolls and inkspens, their minds trained on history, philosophy, and the natural order. But even these centers of learning were not immune to the subtle pull of opium. The scholars' hands, skilled in calligraphy, sometimes shook slightly as they reached for their pipes. The smoke swirled in delicate spirals, catching in the soft lamplight, blurring edges of texts and tables alike. Even as they wrote treatises on virtue and governance, some scribes allowed the substance to ease fatigue, to smooth anxiety, to quiet the relentless pace of thought. Arguments that would once have sparked vigorous debate now softened into gentle nods. Eyes drifted, pens hovered, breaths lengthened. Outside the academy walls, the city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of these quiet changes. Lanterns swung gently over cobblestone streets. Tea shops steamed with fragrant warmth. The distant clatter of horse hooves and market calls formed a constant, soothing backdrop. Within the city, the smoke of opium wafted through certain windows, carried faintly on the evening breeze, invisible yet potent. Scholars whispered of moderation, wrote warnings into margins, and yet the haze persisted, entwining itself with thought and routine. Knowledge, wisdom, and ritual, the proudest achievements of the empire, were now touched by something fleeting and seductive. The balance they worked so carefully to preserve wavered, softly, almost imperceptibly, like the flicker of a lantern in a calm room. Along the northern borders, where the wind cut sharp across plains and mountains, the Empire's soldiers kept watch. They were trained to endure, to remain vigilant against threats both real and imagined. Yet even here, the subtle influence of opium began to make its presence known. After long days of drilling, of standing in the biting cold, soldiers sought relief. In small, discreet corners of garrisons, pipes were lit, the smoke curling in slow, lazy spirals. Muscles that ached from endless repetition softened. Minds that had sharpened for strategy and observation softened as well. Eyes that once scanned horizons with steady focus now blinked more often, drifting inward rather than outward. Evening winds carried the faint scent of poppy resin across the encampment. Lanterns flickered against tent flaps, casting gentle shadows that seemed to lengthen in time with the soldiers' breathing. Outside, the stars shone with cold, distant clarity, indifferent to human indulgence. Commanders noticed subtle lapses, delays in response, sluggish movements, decisions slower than usual. Yet they spoke quietly among themselves, unsure how to enforce discipline without alienating the very men they relied upon. The army, like the rest of the empire, faced a slow erosion of its alertness, softened by comfort disguised as respite. The empire's strength, once absolute and unquestioned, now held fragile threads. Even as soldiers drifted into hazy rest, distant mountains, standing sentinel against the north winds, bore silent witness to a subtle unraveling that no decree or order could immediately halt. In the teeming streets of southern ports, merchants and middlemen moved like shadows, unseen yet essential to the flow of opium. Chests were exchanged discreetly beneath dim lantern light, ledgers adjusted quietly, and coins counted with meticulous care. For some, the trade brought wealth beyond imagination. For others, it offered a quiet sense of security, a way to keep families fed and businesses afloat. The scent of opium lingered in the air, sweet and heady, mingling with the salt and tar of the harbor. It was almost tangible, a gentle fog that wrapped around market stalls and narrow alleyways. Smoke rose in slow, curling ribbons, seeping into small rooms where traders signed contracts and made promises they hoped to keep. Voices were low, polite, careful, not loud, not aggressive, but persistent in their intent. Silver flowed outward, but profits flowed inward. A delicate balance emerged, invisible to those in the capital, yet strong enough to sustain a system that moved on its own momentum. Families prospered quietly, wealth built behind screens of secrecy and ritual, a network hidden in plain sight. For some, this newfound prosperity was intoxicating in its own right, a different sort of haze that mirrored the physical one in subtle ways. Even as the empire tried to impose limits, the invisible currents of profit carried the trade forward, patient, relentless, and difficult to stem. The smoke and the silver intertwined, a pair of quiet but potent forces shaping the empire's future in ways that would soon ripple far beyond the docks, reaching every corner of a world that believed itself stable and eternal. In villages and towns, the effects of opium reached beyond markets and soldiers, touching the most intimate spaces of daily life. The homes where families gathered under lantern light. Parents returned from work, cheeks flushed from labor or worry, and sometimes sought solace in small doses of the fragrant resin. Children slept nearby, unaware of the slow drift unfolding in rooms filled with curling smoke. The quiet crackle of embers in clay stoves mingled with the sweet scent, creating an atmosphere both warm and heavy. Conversations softened. Laughter was slower, gentler, often cut short as adults leaned back into cushions or mats, eyelids heavy. Meals were eaten more mechanically, chores delayed, and subtle patterns of attention shifted. Neighbors noticed changes, whispered with concern, or looked away to preserve harmony. Opium, gentle and insidious, blurred the lines between necessity and indulgence. Parents who once read bedtime stories now drifted off mid-sentence. Artisans who once crafted with precision found their hands less steady, their patience thinner. Yet no one cried out openly. Shame and secrecy wrapped around the habit like soft, suffocating silk. Outside, the world continued in its slow rhythm. Moonlight traced patterns over rooftops. Wind rustled bamboo and reeds, carrying the faint, persistent aroma of poppy flowers from distant fields. Within homes, smoke mingled with sighs, soft and patient, weaving through the nights like an invisible thread, binding people to comfort, even as it loosened the fabric of everyday life. Inside the Forbidden City, the opium crisis created quiet tensions that threaded through palace halls like a low hum. Advisors and ministers, each with their own ambitions and fears, whispered in private chambers. Some urged decisive action, pressing for strict enforcement and harsh penalties. Others cautioned restraint, warning that disrupting trade might provoke foreign powers or unsettle domestic markets. Lantern light glimmered off polished floors as courtiers moved through corridors, careful to avoid missteps or overheard words. The emperor, aware of these divisions, listened patiently, weighing each argument with the precision demanded of centuries of rulership. His face remained calm, serene even, yet within him stirred an unease that could not be soothed by ceremony or ritual alone. Smoke from incense coils drifted through the halls, softening edges and filling the air with warm, familiar fragrance. Outside, moonlight pooled in courtyards, revealing the quiet beauty of carved stone paths and flowering gardens. Inside, the tension remained hidden, subtle, like a slow ripple under a still pond, visible only if one watched very closely. Even as the court debated, the world beyond the palace walls continued its quiet drift. Opium, traded, smoked, and consumed in shadowed rooms, moved along rivers and roads, through towns and villages, gathering momentum. The emperor sensed it, as one senses a storm in the distance, though its exact shape remained unclear. And so, within the heart of China, calm facades masked the first tremors of a challenge that would ripple through the empire in ways both subtle and profound. Even as opium flowed quietly through homes and markets, its effects on the body began to show. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible, eyes that once sparkled with clarity grew slightly duller. Fingers that once moved with skill hesitated, trembled. Sleep, once deep and restorative, became fragmented, drifting in hazy cycles that left the mind neither fully awake nor fully at rest. In small villages, doctors and herbalists noticed the patterns. Patients came with persistent coughs, palpitations, and fatigue that did not respond to ordinary remedies. Families whispered, concerned yet uncertain, unsure whether to blame circumstance or habit. The air inside rooms smelled faintly of burning poppy resin, a heady sweetness that softened the senses even as it slowly wore them down. Even in bustling cities, the pattern repeated itself. Craftsmen and scholars, traders and laborers now were entirely immune. Some slept in fits and starts, waking with a lingering heaviness, the faint aroma of smoke clinging to hair and clothing. The body began to betray the mind's intentions. Energy waned, discipline softened, attention frayed. Yet the empire remained outwardly strong. Markets thrived, walls and gates stood firm. Soldiers marched in formation. From the outside, China's might appeared intact, but beneath the surface, the steady, almost imperceptible toll of opium had begun to erode the foundation of daily life. Each inhalation, each indulgence, carried a quiet cost, a subtle weakening that no ledger or edict could fully capture. In the hills and valleys beyond the imperial cities, whispers began to stir. Not full-blown revolts, not yet, but murmurs carried on the wind like shadows in the evening mist. Traders, farmers, and soldiers, feeling the subtle strain of opium's influence and the silver drain, shared quiet complaints in taverns and tea-houses. Words softened by fear and respect for authority, nonetheless hinted at frustration, confusion, and uncertainty about the future. Along riverbanks, where fishermen hauled nets in the cool night, conversations drifted toward longing for fairness and stability. In market squares, artisans leaned on benches, speaking softly of rising prices and the increasing dependence on a foreign substance that seemed to bend both trade and life to its will. Smoke from nearby opium pipes curled toward the sky, almost invisible yet pervasive, mixing with the scent of wet earth and lantern oil. Even minor tensions carried weight in the hearts of those who felt the empire's promise slipping. Yet these murmurs, small and dispersed, were easy to overlook. Authorities dismissed them as idle chatter, too faint to warrant attention. The empire's vastness, its sheer size and order, made local discontent appear inconsequential. Still, the whispers persisted. Like a distant echo of an approaching storm, they suggested that even the quiet, patient drift of smoke could awaken something larger. And though nothing erupted that night, the seed of unrest had been planted, nurtured quietly by economic strain, weakened bodies, and the gentle haze of indulgence that now touched every corner of the land. Within government offices, the struggle over opium grew more personal. Officials who had sworn oaths to uphold the law found themselves caught between duty and desire. Some had tried the substance in small amounts, initially out of curiosity or exhaustion, and found its soft haze strangely comforting. The warm, sweet smoke dulled the edges of worry, offering a brief respite from endless paperwork and political intrigue. Even as they enforced restrictions on traders and citizens, these same men sometimes lingered in private rooms, inhaling deeply and feeling a fleeting sense of calm. The dichotomy gnawed at them a persistent awareness that they were both guardians and participants in a system increasingly dictated by opium's slow, patient influence. Night in these offices was quiet. Lanterns glowed softly, casting long shadows across ink-stained desks. The occasional rustle of paper or gentle creak of a chair was magnified in the stillness. Outside, wind carried the faint, pervasive aroma of poppy smoke from distant streets and homes, mingling with the earthy scent of rain on cobblestones and the faint tang of wood fires. Despite inner conflict, decisions continued to be made, sometimes strict, sometimes lax. The inconsistency created loopholes that traders exploited, while officials quietly navigated their own desires and responsibilities. In this subtle web of compromise, the empire's strength was tested not by war or invasion, but by human frailty, indulgence, and the gentle pull of comfort over discipline. The southern ports, always vibrant with life, now hummed with a tension as delicate as the scent of opium smoke drifting through alleyways. Sailors unloaded goods under lantern light, their boots clattering on wooden docks that smelled of salt, tar, and wet wood. Merchants whispered in hushed tones, weighing risks against profit, while customs officials patrolled the edges, aware of smuggled chests tucked beneath cargo, but unable to seize them all. Even the water seemed to carry unease. Waves lapped gently against hulls, reflecting the flickering glow of lanterns in fractured patterns. Fog rolled in from the sea, wrapping piers in a cool, damp embrace that blurred boundaries and softened sharp edges. Conversations slowed, gestures became more cautious, and shadows lengthened, as if aware of the quiet danger lurking in the air. Opium, subtle yet persistent, shaped every interaction. Traders measured doses for clients with precision, even as they calculated silver flowing outward. Laborers, tired from hauling goods, sometimes inhaled a brief respite, seeking warmth in the familiar haze. The port pulsed like a living organism, veins of commerce intertwined with smoke, patience, and risk. Authorities, aware yet hesitant, moved cautiously. A misstep could spark confrontation or diplomatic conflict. So, the delicate balance continued, commerce and indulgence entwined, danger hidden beneath calm surfaces, and the empire's foundation quietly tested by forces both human and chemical. In a quiet study high above a bustling city, a lone scholar sat hunched over his desk, inkstone at hand, brush poised but hesitant. Moonlight spilled through paper screens, illuminating the delicate swirls of calligraphy that filled his scrolls. Outside, the soft rustle of leaves and distant clatter of carts reminded him that life continued beyond his walls, oblivious to the struggle he wrestled with inside. The scholar had spent years studying history, governance, and human behavior. He had seen the patterns of empires rise and fall, the subtle erosion of virtue and discipline that could quietly topple even the strongest dynasties. Now, as he inhaled the faint, sweet aroma of opium, partly out of exhaustion, partly out of curiosity, he felt a shiver of despair. How could a people so disciplined, so proud, allow something so seductive to take root and spread without resistance? His brush hovered over the scroll, hesitation stretching like a shadow across the page. Words he once wrote with confidence now seemed fragile, unable to fully capture the creeping decay he observed. Each puff of smoke drew him inward, softening his judgment, blurring the line between observation and participation. He wrote of caution, of balance, of the need for vigilance, but the haze made even these exhortations seem distant, almost abstract. Outside, lanterns flickered in neighboring homes. Wind carried the mingling scents of earth, smoke, and night blossoms, and the world moved on in gentle rhythms. The scholar's lament was private, unspoken, a quiet note against the symphony of ordinary life. Yet in his awareness, the first seeds of foresight took root, in understanding that the empire's greatest danger was not always visible, and that vigilance, once eroded, was difficult to reclaim. As opium's influence spread, the empire began to feel a subtle, almost imperceptible divide. Cities thrummed with commerce and light, while the countryside slowed under the quiet pull of habit. Traders and officials profited, yet farmers and laborers struggled with weakened bodies and fading discipline. The world felt uneven, as if the empire were a vast tapestry whose threads were stretching and fraying in unexpected places. Along rivers and canals, barges moved slowly, their crews softened by fatigue and the faint haze that clung to their lungs. Lanterns reflected on dark waters, shimmering like fractured silver, while reeds whispered to one another in the night wind. Markets remained vibrant, yet prices crept upward, creating quiet frustration among those who depended on daily survival rather than trade profits. Within towns, families felt the subtle weight of change. Parents leaned back into cushions, drawn by habit, while children's laughter occasionally fell into silence as smoke curled toward the ceiling. Artisans noticed trembling fingers and slower work. Soldiers experienced hesitation in drills, and scholars found their attention wandering during long hours of study. Even small delays or mistakes seemed magnified against the empire's vast machinery. Meanwhile, the capital remained confident, its walls strong, its bureaucracy steady, yet the fissures deepened beneath the surface. The divide was invisible to many, but palpable to those who moved within its currents, a quiet tension woven into the fabric of everyday life. And so, the empire carried on, unaware that this slow, creeping change might one day define its fate. In the narrow lanes of a southern trading city, a merchant paused outside his shop. The night air, heavy with the scent of salt, incense, and distant poppy smoke. His ledgers lay open, detailing profits and losses, silver moving outward and opium moving inward, the numbers as precise as the lines of calligraphy he so carefully maintained. Yet a shadow of unease lingered behind his eyes. He knew that trade was lucrative, perhaps more than anything he had experienced in decades. Families depended on him, businesses grew, opportunities stretched like endless rivers before him. Yet with each transaction, he also felt the weight of consequence, subtle harm that filtered into homes, neighborhoods, and lives. Children grew restless when parents lingered in smoke-filled rooms. Workers arrived sluggish, their hands less steady, their laughter quieter. The prosperity was real, yet tinged with an invisible cost. At night, he sat alone in his shop, listening to the soft creak of wooden shutters and the distant lap of waves against docks. A lantern flickered, casting dancing shadows across his walls and the piles of goods he had so carefully arranged. He inhaled, considered the warmth, the brief comfort, then hesitated. How long could trade continue before the quiet damage he witnessed became impossible to ignore? Outside, the city slept unevenly, some streets alive with activity, others softened by the gentle pull of indulgence. And within the merchant, a slow tension built. Profit and responsibility, ease and morality, all caught together in the haze of an empire being reshaped in quiet, almost invisible ways. In a quiet study tucked within the walls of a provincial city, a scholarly official sat hunched over papers, a single oil lamp casting warm pools of light across his desk. Outside, the night was still, the distant hum of market activity softened by darkness. The scholar's eyes were weary from long hours of reviewing reports, interpreting laws, and considering the consequences of opiums spread throughout the empire. Yet tonight, like so many nights before, he allowed himself a brief indulgence. A small pipe rested between his fingers, its fragrant smoke curling upward, soft and soothing. The warmth calmed the tension coiling in his chest, easing his mind as he pondered reports of declining silver reserves, growing unrest in distant provinces, and subtle lapses in local governance. Each inhalation brought a fleeting clarity, even as it dulled the edge of caution. He understood the contradictions within himself, the duty to uphold law and order, and the human desire for temporary relief from exhaustion and worry. Inkbrush paused mid-stroke, thought suspended in the gentle haze. Outside, wind rustled through bamboo groves, carrying faint traces of opium from nearby homes. Lanterns flickered across quiet streets, painting shadows that stretched lazily over stone paths. In this delicate balance of responsibility and indulgence, the scholar official represented a larger truth about the empire. Even those most committed to its preservation were not immune to opium's quiet seduction. And so, the empire's fate rested not only on distant decrees but also on countless private decisions made in softly lit rooms, each one a tiny ripple in a growing current. In city halls and magistrates' offices, the subtle influence of opium began to manifest in ways that were nearly invisible. Papers lay unfinished on desks, decisions delayed by hesitation or fatigue. Clerks arrived late, their eyes dull, hands trembling slightly as they counted coins or copied records. Even the most diligent officials found their focus wavering, caught between duty and the gentle pull of indulgence. The offices smelled faintly of ink, wood, and the distant aroma of poppy smoke drifting in from alleys and private chambers. Lanterns flickered softly, casting dancing shadows over polished floors and neatly stacked ledgers. The rhythm of daily work slowed imperceptibly, each small delay accumulating like sand in an hourglass. Whispers circulated quietly among staff. Some feared reprimand for leniency. Others envied those who indulged in secrecy. Enforcement of opium bans grew inconsistent, often dependent on the personal restraint or lack thereof. Individual officials, rules that seemed absolute on paper, became malleable in practice, bending to the whims of human weakness. Outside, life continued as usual. Markets buzzed with energy. Children played along riverbanks, and boats slid quietly through canals. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, the machinery of governance, once precise and reliable, was softening. The subtle corrosion of attention and discipline, invisible to many, quietly reshaped the empire from within, leaving its strength vulnerable even as its cities appeared calm and orderly. At the edge of China's southern coast, the harbors were alive with movement, yet wrapped in an almost meditative quiet at night. Sailors leaned against masts, listening to the rhythmic slap of waves against hulls. Lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, casting pools of golden light that fractured on the water's surface. Amid the bustling docks, the smell of salt, tar, and smoke blended into a thick, almost tangible fog. Hidden in warehouses and shadowed alleys, small groups of men monitored the flow of opium with patient vigilance. Every chest, every parcel, every transaction was noted, recorded, or whispered about in low tones. Smoke from pipes curled lazily through the air, a quiet companion to the murmur of voices and the soft creak of timbers. The world felt suspended in slow motion, every breath measured, every movement deliberate. Even as traders and smugglers moved with practiced skill, they were aware of the invisible eyes that watched from the shadows. The tension was subtle but constant, like the low hum of a distant drum beneath the night. Ships rocked gently against the tide, as if aware that each cargo carried both opportunity and risk, profit and danger intertwined in delicate balance. Far from the eyes of the emperor and the capital, the harbors thrummed with life and secrecy. Lanterns reflected on rippling water, footsteps echoed softly on planks, and the gentle aroma of opium lingered, weaving a quiet narrative of commerce, caution, and inevitability. The empire's future moved in these hidden currents, patient and unstoppable, while the night held its breath. Inland, the empire's great rivers carried more than water. They became subtle highways for opium, flowing alongside rice barges, fishing boats, and traders' vessels. Mist hovered above the surface in the early hours, softening the outlines of the banks and cloaking the passing boats in a delicate, almost dreamlike haze. The scent of wet earth mingled with the sweet tang of poppy smoke, drifting lazily into small villages along the banks. Fishermen paused in their nets, inhaling the faint warmth of the substance that had become both a comfort and a quiet burden. Farmers resting under trees allowed themselves a momentary escape from the day's labor, smoke curling around them like gentle fog. Even officials who traveled along the rivers could not entirely avoid it, the pervasive aroma insinuating itself into rooms and minds with quiet persistence. The water reflected the sky's shifting colors, pale silver, soft gold, deep indigo, while carrying whispers of trade, indulgence, and subtle unrest. Life along the rivers felt slower, softened by the gentle haze that touched both body and spirit. Children played along the banks, oblivious to the currents shaping their parents' actions, while the empire's pulse, vast and complex, felt slightly dulled by the quiet seduction flowing through its veins. In these waterways, the empire's strength and discipline were tested not by armies or storms, but by a patient, invisible force. The rivers of smoke moved as naturally as the rivers of water, shaping the land and its people in ways that no decree, no law, and no distant warning could immediately reverse. As night descended across the empire, marketplaces took on a softer, almost suspended quality. Lanterns glimmered along narrow streets, casting gentle pools of light on cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Merchants began to close their stalls, the calls of buyers fading into murmurs, while the faint, sweet aroma of opium lingered in hidden corners, weaving through the air like a quiet fog. Even as the city slowed, some patrons lingered. A craftsman, his hands tired from hours at the loom, inhaled the familiar warmth that eased his aches. A scholar paused under a lantern, smoke curling around his shoulders as he considered the weight of letters and scrolls before him. The world felt soft, pliable, edges blurred, as though the night itself had yielded to the subtle seduction of comfort. Conversations were hushed, laughter tempered by fatigue, footsteps slowed. Even animals moved with gentle deliberation, cats winding silently among stalls, and dogs resting under the shade of lantern-lit awnings. The rhythm of life itself had become measured, patient, and slightly dulled, a gentle lull suspended in time. Beyond the immediate calm, the empire's undercurrents shifted imperceptibly. Decisions that might have been made swiftly were delayed. Actions that might have been decisive became tentative. And yet, within this softened atmosphere, there remained a strange beauty, the silver of lantern reflections on cobblestones, the faint scent of incense mingling with smoke, the soft, steady breathing of a world at rest, even as it slowly changed. Along the walls of northern garrisons, soldiers moved with quiet precision, their boots echoing softly against stone. The sun had long dipped behind distant mountains, and lanterns cast a warm, flickering glow across the camp. Yet even here, in disciplined formations meant to safeguard the empire, opium had begun to leave its mark. After long hours of drills and watch, some soldiers sought refuge in small, private corners of the barracks. Pipes glimmered in dim light as smoke curled lazily upward, softening taut muscles and easing the tension in minds honed for vigilance. The aroma, sweet and heavy, blended with the earthy scent of the cold stone floors and the faint tank of metal weapons, creating a quiet, almost meditative atmosphere. Those who partook felt the immediate calm, a fleeting respite from constant duty. Eyes half closed, bodies relaxed. The night stretched longer, gentler, yet subtle lapses emerged. A delayed response to a roll call, a slower adjustment of armor, a softened step during sentry rounds. The soldiers' discipline, once sharp and unyielding, now bent slightly under the weight of comfort. Outside, wind whispered across the ramparts, carrying the scent of pine, distant fires, and river water. The stars reflected faintly on frozen patches of ground and rippling rivers, indifferent to the tiny erosion taking place within. And within the barracks, the soft hum of smoke and quiet breathing wove a lullaby of temporary izan, invisible, patient force testing the empire's resilience in ways no army drill could anticipate. In shadowed alleyways and discreet corners of cities, hidden opium dens thrived, small sanctuaries of indulgence tucked away from the gaze of authorities. The entrances were unassuming, a worn wooden door, a curtained window. The faint scent of incense, mixed with smoke drifting outward like a soft invitation. Inside, the world slowed to a gentle rhythm, almost as if time itself had yielded to the warm haze. The rooms were dimly lit, lanterns casting pools of soft amber light across low cushions and polished floors. Patrons reclined in quiet circles, pipes held delicately, eyes half-lidded, breaths deep and measured. The sweet aroma of opium mingled with the faint tang of tea, wood, and paper, creating an atmosphere both soothing and heady. Conversation was minimal, gestures careful, laughter subdued, replaced by long pauses filled with the gentle sound of inhaled smoke and exhaled clouds curling toward the ceiling. Even the music, if any, was soft, a string plucked slowly, a flute's gentle sigh, or the distant hum of a lute carried in from another room. Every sound and scent worked together, crafting a cocoon where the world outside its pressures, its demands, its edicts seemed distant and irrelevant. For a moment, worries softened, limbs relaxed, and the mind floated, drifting toward a quiet, almost hypnotic stillness. And yet, outside these doors, the empire continued its delicate balancing act. Markets, rivers, farms, and garrisons carried on, seemingly untouched, while hidden dens nurtured a subtle shift. The smoke that rose in soft spirals was more than comforted, was a quiet force, shaping habits, attention, and the empire's very pulse, one inhalation at a time. Along China's vast network of rivers, life carried on with a soft, measured rhythm. Fishermen hauled in nets, their movements slower than in the bright light of day. Muscles relaxed as the gentle weight of fatigue settled into their bones. Smoke from small opium pipes drifted from riverside huts, blending with the evening mist that rose off the water in pale silver sheets. The scent was faint yet persistent, curling upward and merging with the earthy aroma of damp soil and reeds. Lanterns on boats swayed with the gentle current, reflecting in ripples that shimmered and danced like liquid gold. Children, long since finished with play, watched the slow movement of the water with quiet fascination, while elders leaned back against wooden railings, eyes soft and thoughtful. Even the animals, the dogs that padded along the banks, the birds settling in nearby trees, seemed to move more deliberately, attuned to the lull of the evening. In small homes along the rivers, families gathered quietly. Cushions were arranged, tea brewed, and pipes lit with delicate care. The smoke curled in lazy spirals, softening tensions, easing aches, and wrapping the room in a gentle cocoon of warmth and calm. Conversations were hushed, reflective, punctuated only by soft laughter or the occasional sigh, carrying the weight of long days and the invisible pull of habit. The empire, vast and intricate, seemed to hold its breath along these waterways. The rivers reflected the moon's pale light, mirroring a world moving in slow, careful patterns. Yet beneath the surface, currents of change twisted unseen. The gentle, pervasive influence of opium flowed alongside commerce, family life, and quiet labor, an invisible companion shaping the empire's nights, one calm, smoky exhalation at a time. High atop city walls and garrison towers, night watchers kept their silent vigil. Lanterns swung gently in the wind, casting narrow beams of light across stone pathways and courtyards. Soldiers leaned against the battlements, their eyes scanning distant rooftops and streets, attuned to movement, sound, and shadow. Yet even in these bastions of discipline, the subtle influence of opium had begun to make itself felt. Some soldiers carried small pipes, hidden carefully beneath cloaks or tucked into pockets. Inhale by inhale, muscles that had been tense with vigilance softened, and minds that had once remained sharply focused began to drift into quiet reverie. The night stretched longer, calmer, gentler, as though the world itself had conspired to lull the watchers into temporary respite. The wind carried scents of earth, distant fires, and faint poppy smoke. Lantern light reflected in puddles left by earlier rains, creating a delicate tapestry of gold and silver along the stone. Even the stars seemed muted, twinkling softly through a haze that mirrored the subtle fog rolling across the streets below. Despite the gentle calm, a quiet tension lingered, an awareness, perhaps subconscious, that balance was shifting. Eyes blinked more slowly, decisions were delayed, and the sharp edge of duty dulled in the warmth of indulgence. The Empire's guardians, essential to its protection, were now quietly entwined with the very force threatening to erode vigilance from within, a delicate interplay of discipline and human frailty under the soft cover of night. In the quiet corners of academies and study halls, the influence of opium whispered gently yet persistently. Scholars bent over scrolls, manuscripts, and inkstones, their minds once sharp and disciplined, now touched by a subtle haze. The scent of ink mingled with the sweet aroma of opium, drifting through rooms where lanterns glowed softly, casting long, gentle shadows across the walls. Some scholars had begun to rely on the substance for focus or, perhaps, for escape. Hours passed with the slow scratch of brushes, punctuated by soft exhalations as smoke curled in spirals toward the ceiling. Debates, once vigorous and fiery, softened into gentle nods and murmured agreement. Eyes once vigilant for errors grew heavy, and arguments that might have been decisive now drifted into gentle suggestions, careful phrasing, and hesitation. Outside, the city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware of the slow erosion taking place in minds that shaped policy, knowledge, and culture. The hum of distant markets, the occasional clatter of horse hooves, and the wind whispering through bamboo groves formed a soft backdrop to the quiet transformation within. Even the faint rustle of paper seemed to harmonize with the drifting smoke, creating an atmosphere of serene, almost hypnotic contemplation. The Empire's future, shaped by these careful minds, now faced subtle distortion. Insight was still present, but dulled, softened by comfort. The strength of governance, scholarship, and strategy, once unwavering, was now gently entwined with indulgence, leaving the state vulnerable in ways almost invisible, yet steadily growing. The Empire's vast rivers carried more than goods, they carried the subtle weight of opium's presence. Barges glided silently through the night, their hulls cutting gentle arcs in moonlit waters. Lanterns hung from masts, casting reflections that danced on rippling surfaces, while the soft scent of poppy smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of wet reeds and river mud. Merchants and boatmen moved with deliberate care, their movements measured, softened by fatigue and indulgence. Conversations were sparse, spoken in hushed tones, punctuated by occasional laughter that seemed gentler, slower. Pipes rested lightly between fingers, exhalations rising in curling clouds that hovered above the decks, blending seamlessly with mist and moonlight. The rhythm of trade was both steady and subtle. Silver continued its flow outward, opium inward, each transaction a quiet echo in the vast machinery of the Empire. Along riverbanks, lights twinkled from small villages, smoke trailing from modest homes and tiny dens, carrying the scent into the night. Farmers paused from labor to rest, leaning against boats or under trees, drawn into the warm embrace of the gentle haze. Even as commerce thrived, the Empire's pulse slowed imperceptibly. Discipline softened, attentiveness waned, and vigilance became a delicate balance between necessity and indulgence. The rivers, like veins through the body of the land, carried more than trade. They carried the quiet, pervasive influence shaping the Empire's nights, subtly weaving comfort and complacency into every bend and eddy. In towns and villages far from the imperial centers, the subtle grip of opium became more pronounced. Families leaned into quiet evenings, the aroma of smoke curling from small pipes like a companion in the dim lamplight. Laborers, exhausted from long days of toil, found relief in its gentle warmth. Scholars and clerks, weighed down by endless responsibilities, inhaled to soften the edge of fatigue. Life moved at a slightly slower, gentler rhythm, edges softened by habit. Evenings stretched longer, cushions became more inviting, beds more necessary, and routines slightly delayed. Conversations softened, laughter became infrequent, and attention drifted in the warm embrace of smoke. Children watched their parents with growing awareness, sometimes mimicking the subtle gestures of inhalation, not understanding fully the ritual, but absorbing its rhythm. At markets, the flow of silver outward and opium inward created subtle tension. Merchants thrived, yet dependency deepened, creating a silent loop that touched every corner of life. Officials and soldiers, scholars and tradespeople, all became entwined with habits that dulled vigilance even as they offered temporary comfort. The Empire, vast and intricate, appeared outwardly strong, Yet its lifeblood, the attention, discipline, and alertness of its people, was being gently reshaped. What began as occasional indulgence now wove itself into daily existence, a slow, steady current that no decree could reverse, quietly binding the empire to the unseen hands of commerce and habit. In the heart of the Forbidden City, the emperor and his closest advisors convened under the soft glow of lanterns. Reports had grown more urgent, silver leaving the empire at unprecedented rates, officials struggling with fatigue and distraction, and the subtle unrest murmuring through towns and ports. The air was thick with incense, a deliberate attempt to maintain clarity amidst worry. Yet even the calming fragrance could not mask the tension. Edicts were drafted, revised, and debated. Crackdowns on opium dens were proposed, stricter enforcement of trade laws considered, and punishments for smugglers discussed in careful, deliberate tones. The emperor, ever measured, weighed the cost of decisive action against the potential for rebellion or international conflict. Every word, every signature, carried the weight of centuries of tradition and responsibility. Beyond the palace walls, lanterns flickered over city streets, their light reflecting off cobblestones slick from recent rain. Smoke still curled from hidden corners, drifting lazily into the night air. Markets and rivers hummed with quiet life, yet each movement, each transaction, now carried an undercurrent of tension. Commerce, entwined with secrecy, comforts shadowed by consequence. The empire's response, though deliberate and cautious, was only a step against a subtle tide. The influence of opium had already seeped into countless lives, softening vigilance and reshaping daily rhythms. The emperor and his advisors moved carefully, aware that their actions might slow the current. But the river of habit had begun to flow in ways both intricate and persistent, challenging the very foundation of the empire's strength. In quiet homes across the empire, the sweet relief of opium carried with it a subtle, often unseen cost. Parents relaxed into cushions, children slept nearby, and the warmth of smoke softened muscles and minds alike. Yet beneath this comfort, attention waned, discipline faltered, and subtle patterns of dependency grew. Artisans' hands trembled slightly, precision dulled by habit. Soldiers delayed steps in drills, their alertness quietly eroded by evenings spent in gentle haze. Clerks miscounted coins or missed details in ledgers, their focus weakened, though their intentions remained steadfast. Even scholars, guardians of knowledge and tradition, felt the edges of their insight softened by the persistent calm. Outside, the world appeared unchanged. Lanterns flickered along streets, boats glided silently through rivers, markets thrived, and families moved through daily life with apparent normalcy. Yet each inhalation of smoke carried a small surrender, a quiet reshaping of thought and action, leaving the empire more vulnerable than its outward appearances suggested. The comfort opium offered was real and immediate, but its hidden toll stretched far beyond individual indulgence. It threaded through homes, offices, barracks, and ports, knitting together a web of softened vigilance and quiet dependency. The empire, vast and proud, now bore the gentle weight of a subtle erosion, one inhalation at a time. In remote provinces and border towns, the quiet influence of opium began to intersect with frustration over taxes, trade restrictions, and the drain of silver. Murmurs of discontent carried along mountain paths and river valleys, whispered in tea houses and marketplaces. The haze of indulgence softened minds, but it could not entirely dull the sense of injustice or fatigue among those who bore the daily burdens of labor and oversight. Small groups of farmers and workers spoke quietly in the evenings, debating fairness, sharing grievances, and imagining what might happen if distant officials paid closer attention to their hardships. The opium haze lent their words a slow, meditative cadence, softening anger but allowing it to persist beneath calm exteriors. Ideas, once sharp and fleeting, now lingered, forming subtle networks of thought that began to ripple outward, unseen by distant authorities. Along riverbanks and narrow roads, traders noticed increased caution, whispers of hesitation, and an unusual awareness in the eyes of their neighbors. Even minor missteps could spark rumors, and rumors traveled swiftly in a world where attention was already dulled. The empire, vast and seemingly unshakable, began to feel the quiet stirrings of unrest, its edges softened by habit, yet vulnerable to the currents of frustration flowing beneath the surface. In homes, villages, and hidden corners, the dual forces of comfort and tension coexisted, creating a delicate balance. The empire's strength remained outwardly intact, yet beneath the calm, seeds of rebellion were taking root, nurtured by both human ambition and the gentle, persistent influence of opium. Throughout the vast empire, the threads of daily life were under subtle, persistent strain. Officials balanced law enforcement with personal indulgence, soldiers walked alert, yet softened by habit, and families navigated homes scented with smoke, comfort, and quiet fatigue. Even markets and rivers, the arteries of trade and communication, moved with efficiency tinged by the gentle pull of indulgence. Night brought a deceptive calm. Lanterns flickered along streets and riverbanks, their reflections stretching across rippling water. In hidden rooms and small dens, smoke curled upward in languid spirals, softening attention and blurring the sharp edges of responsibility. Voices became hushed, gestures slower, and even laughter carried a weight of hesitation. The empire's machinery, once precise and unyielding, now operated under the subtle influence of opium's pervasive presence. Delays and lapses, though minor in isolation, accumulated across regions, offices, and households, creating ripples of vulnerability. The vast network of governance, trade, and defense strained under a quiet erosion that no edict could immediately reverse. And yet, outwardly, the empire remained majestic. Walls stood tall, fleets sailed dutifully, and scholars continued their studies. The quiet strain was invisible to most, a delicate tension threading through every aspect of life, an undercurrent shaping the fate of an empire that still believed in its permanence, unaware of how deeply habit had intertwined with its strength. By this point, the presence of opium had entwined itself deeply into the empire's daily rhythms. Across cities, towns, and villages, the gentle haze lingered, not always visible, but felt in softened attention, delayed responses, and the quiet lowering of vigilance. Habits, once occasional, had become embedded patterns, shaping behavior, judgment, and even perception of time. In quiet homes, families moved with deliberate care, smoke curling around them like a protective shroud. Parents' eyes softened, hands relaxed, and even the sharpest minds found moments of slow drift into introspection or dreamlike thought. In markets and ports, merchants balanced profit and caution, aware of risks but softened by routine indulgence. Soldiers walked watchful paths with steady but slower steps, and scholars debated with gentler tones, careful phrasing replacing sharp argument. The empire's outward appearance remained unchanged. Lanterns still reflected on rivers, temples glowed softly in courtyards, and the hum of daily life continued unabated. Yet beneath this calm, the subtle erosion persisted. Habits, once small and private, had rippled outward to affect governance, commerce, and defense. Each inhalation, each indulgent evening, wove into the fabric of the empire, creating a network of dependence, invisible but pervasive. In this haze, the empire seemed tranquil and patient, yet its pulse carried the quiet rhythm of vulnerability. The legacy of indulgence, commerce, and human weakness now shaped the very character of the state. A reminder that even the mightiest empires could be touched and softened from within by forces both unseen and irresistible. As decades passed, the influence of opium left its subtle, unyielding mark on the empire. Lanterns still flickered across streets and riverbanks. Markets continued to hum with life, and scholars debated beneath the soft glow of study lamps. Yet, beneath the surface of daily routines, the threads of discipline, vigilance, and prosperity had frayed, softened by the persistent haze that had quietly woven itself into every corner of life. Homes carried the gentle scent of smoke, families moved in measured, softened rhythms, and even the empire's defenders, soldiers, officials, merchants, and scholars felt the quiet pull of habit in their movements and decisions. Trade and governance, once precise and unyielding, now accommodated the delicate, persistent influence of indulgence. Minor lapses accumulated, decisions softened, and vigilance wavered, all beneath the facade of stability. The empire's vast rivers continued to carry commerce, and its walls and fleets still stood proud. But beneath this appearance, change had already taken root. The world seemed calm, even serene, yet the subtle erosion of strength, focus, and foresight had reshaped the very character of the state. Comfort had become a companion, habit a quiet master, and the empire, once unshakable, now moved through time with a patient, uncertain rhythm. And so, the story of opium and its impact comes to rest here, in the quiet folds of history. The empire's legacy remains, complex and enduring, a reminder of the delicate interplay between human desire, commerce, and governance. Thank you for following this journey through China's greatest empire. As the lanterns fade and the rivers settle, allow your mind to drift gently into rest. Reflect on the subtle forces that shape our lives and history alike. Remember to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts with friends near and far, whether you're watching from the US, Europe, Canada, or elsewhere. Good night, and may your sleep be calm and deep.